Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our presentation today. Per the presenter's preference, my intro will be very brief. Wayne Cornelius, UC San Diego, Professor Emeritus of Political Science, retired in 2009. He joined the UC San Diego faculty in 1979 and was named Distinguished Professor of Political Science in 1997. Cornelius's expertise on immigration policy has been long sought out by public officials and presidential administrations. He was a policy advisor to both candidates, Pete Buttigieg and Joe Biden, during the 2020 election cycle, has testified before Congress, and was more recently an advisor to President Biden's transition team on U.S. immigration and asylum policy. In 2012, Mexican President Felipe Calderón awarded Cornelius the Orden Mexicana de Aguilar Azteca, Mexico's highest honor for non-citizens. Please welcome distinguished Professor Wayne Cornelius. Go ahead,
Thank you so much. Can we have slides up?
Yes, pulling them up right away.
Good. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes. Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm just sorry that it has to be virtual. But I certainly welcome the opportunity to help all of you try to get up to speed on developments in a turbulent and highly salient area of public policy. Today, I want to focus on three main questions. First, how to explain the current surge in migration to the US-Mexico border. Secondly, and could I have the next slide, please? Secondly, what's the big picture of this development? Namely, the US is struggling to keep people out of the country at a time when we are experiencing a population decline in half of the country. And third, what explains the paralysis on immigration legislation in the US Congress? Next slide. You can view US immigration policy as a roof with many holes in it. Donald Trump and his senior immigration advisor, Stephen Miller, put them there. In just 4 years, they created over 1,000 new restrictions on immigration and asylum. And they did it all through executive action. No new legislation was needed. The overarching goal of all this was to reduce legal immigration to as close to zero as possible, and to completely dismantle our refugee resettlement program. Next slide. Undoing Donald Trump's immigration legacy, as Joe Biden has been trying to do, amounts to making roof repairs during a hurricane. The hurricane is the current migration surge. In fact, there have been 3 such surges under the last 3 presidents. Biden's has been the largest. Next slide. How should we interpret these data? What immigration specialists see is a breakdown of seasonality in the migration flow. Fewer adult Mexicans seeking short-term work in the US, far more Central American migrants, especially families with young children, seeking refuge in the US. But it's not just Central Americans. The current surge also includes a lot of what the government calls extracontinental migrants, extracontinentals, from countries like Ecuador, Brazil, Venezuela, and Cuba. In fact, those extracontinentals made up over a third of the families arriving at our border in July. The Biden surge actually is smaller than it appears to be because of recidivism. About a third of the migrants being taken into custody are repeat entrants, people who have been quickly expelled from the country and who immediately try again. Next slide. The biggest factor driving recidivism is what I call the Title 42 revolving door. Since March of this year, since March of last year, most migrants arriving at the border have been quickly expelled under the authority of a 1942 public health law. These folks aren't allowed to even begin the process of claiming asylum. Within a few hours, they're processed and dumped back into Mexico. These so-called expedited removals have been justified by both the Trump and the Biden administration as necessary to contain COVID-19. But there's hardly any epidemiological basis for this policy. The COVID positivity rate among migrants is actually lower than among residents of most US border communities. There is, however, a very strong political rationale for keeping the policy in place, which is why the Biden administration recently extended it indefinitely. Next slide. What happens to the people being expelled? Many of them try right away to gain entry again by turning themselves into a Border Patrol agent. These are self-turn-ins, or by hooking up with people smugglers. The smugglers have been taking them into increasingly remote desert areas, and it's not surprising that border crossing deaths are up sharply in this fiscal year. 383 bodies had been found by the Border Patrol through July of this year. The real death toll is probably 2 to 3 times that due to undetected bodies. Next slide. This is happening not just because of the Title 42 revolving door, but also because of Trump's wall. Trump wasn't able to build a border wall from sea to shining sea, but he did manage to build 455 miles of new barriers of various kinds, which didn't deter crossings from being made, but it pushed more of them out into the most dangerous areas. Next slide. We now have tens of thousands of people stranded on the Mexican side of the border as a result of several US policies, like remain in Mexico and metering at ports of entry, and the Title 42 expulsions. Next slide. Who are the stranded people? We have some data from interviews conducted in Tijuana during this past winter quarter by UCSD's Mexican Migration Field Research Program. The data show that 4 out of 5 are from Central America. 70% have children with them. The vast majority are victims of violence of one form or another. Most of them hadn't intended to go to the US when they left home. They were just fleeing violence, seeking refuge wherever they could find it. But the violence that they experienced while transiting through Mexico or in Mexican border communities convinced them of the need to seek protection in the US. Next slide. Most of the people interviewed in the UCSD study had been deposited back in Mexico through the so-called Remain in Mexico program. This is a program that was devised by Stephen Miller in 2019. It forces people who have initiated an asylum claim to wait in Mexico for their U.S. immigration court hearing. The wait is very long. By the end of this July, the immigration courts had a backlog of nearly 1.4 million cases. The average time to get a hearing was 891 days, or about 2.4 years to get your day in court. And this time was spent in squalid border camps with extremely high crime rates. This is a horrible policy, and Biden suspended it on his first day in office. But the governors of Texas and Missouri immediately sued him and got the Supreme Court to order Biden to reinstate the program. And the litigation is continuing. Next slide. Let's return to our first key question. Why do we have a migration surge at this particular moment? I think that the four most plausible explanations are these. First, the change in administration. Biden's early attempts to roll back Trump's immigration policies and his more welcoming rhetoric may have encouraged some migrants to try their luck at the border. Second, collapsed economies in Central America. Collapsed because of the pandemic, because of natural disasters like 2 catastrophic hurricanes in 2020, and a severe drought in Guatemala caused by climate change. Fourth, in the United States, there is strong employer demand for labor and growing worker shortages. All of these are important contributing factors to the surge. In social science modeling, we would say that the outcome, the migration surge, was overdetermined. But I think that far too much attention has been focused on Biden's policy changes. The current surge began in early November of last year, months before Biden started reversing Trump's immigration policies. This suggests that the surge represents pent-up demand by asylum seekers who were totally locked out during Trump's presidency. Biden had campaigned for a whole year on the pro-immigrant policies that he's been trying to implement. Specific policy changes made since he was elected didn't fundamentally alter the dynamics of the surge. It would have happened anyway. All that was needed was having a new sheriff in town. What Biden's election did was to rekindle hope, to raise at least the possibility of getting protection in the US, however poor the odds. Next slide. What's the alternative to muddling through with various enforcement measures like Title 42 and Remain in Mexico, producing an endless humanitarian crisis on the border? The so-called root causes approach is considered by virtually all immigration scholars to be an essential part of any solution. The idea is to systematically reduce the push factors in migrant sending countries through policy interventions like development assistance and violence reduction programs. But doing root causes is hard. We don't have a demonstrably effective playbook for fixing failed states like Honduras. And the US domestic politics of root causes are also very hard, because these kinds of policy interventions take time to show visible effects, probably 5 to 10 years or longer. Guatemala actually offers the best chance of success using this approach because most of the people who migrate from that country are economically motivated, and surveys have found that most of them don't really want to stay forever in the United States. So greater access to short-term work visas like the H-2A and the H-2B programs might be a good fit for Guatemalans and could significantly reduce permanent emigration. Next slide. Let's try to put this into a broader perspective. Here are 6 key demographic and fiscal trends that I'd like you to consider. First, a plummeting and historically low total fertility rate, an average of 1.7 births to women of childbearing age, which is far below the replacement level of 2.1. Secondly, rapid population aging, which is depleting the population of economically active workers. Large-scale retirements made more numerous by life is too short retirements linked to the pandemic. Fourth, less population growth occurring due to legal immigration because there are significantly fewer legal immigrants coming in than in previous decades. Fifth, a fiscal implosion in many localities because of the loss of economically active residents. Too few taxpayers to support essential services. And finally, an acute labor shortage across all regions of the country and all sectors of the economy. Next slide. Why is there less legal immigration these days? Well, partly it's because of the pandemic, which shut down U.S. consular services around the world and made it much more difficult to get the interview, the face-to-face interview that's required to get most kinds of visas. But Trump's restrictions have also played a big part, especially the 106 anti-immigration federal regulations that Stephen Miller rammed through, many of which are still in force and may take years to undo. The overall result of all this is that legal immigration is down by more than half. Next slide. Some of these trends are mutually reinforcing, and I'll just give you one example of this. For many years, our fertility rate was propped up by newly arriving immigrants, whose fertility rate was significantly higher than US-born people. Now, with fewer immigrants entering, we're not getting the usual boost to our population growth. And to make things worse, the US-born children of immigrants now have a fertility rate that is close to that of native-born women. Next slide. Most importantly, our labor force growth rate has fallen sharply in recent decades. And the demand for workers is strong, even amid the pandemic. By the end of July, we had 10.1 million unfilled jobs. Now that's partly due to the pandemic, people being afraid to take jobs and services that could expose them to COVID. But it also reflects the longer-term secular trend toward lower labor force growth. New slide. The 2020 census showed that over half of the counties in the United States had lost population during the intercensal period. The orange shaded counties in this graph are the ones that had negative population growth from 2010 to 20. Next slide. The loss of prime working age population was even greater in most places. The dark purple counties are those whose economically active population shrank during this period. Next slide. This raises a big public policy issue that has intrigued me for the last couple of years. Can we somehow mesh immigration policy changes with our changing demography to offset population loss and the deficits in public finances that are caused by population decline? I developed a plan to do just that for the Buttigieg and Biden campaigns. My plan has four main elements. First, increase our intake of legal immigrants and refugees by raising visa caps. Second, steer newly arriving immigrants and refugees to the places that need them most, using a new place-based visa program. Communities could opt in or out of the program. Visa holders would choose from an online list of counties and municipalities that have opted into the program, and they would have to specify at least one of those preferred destinations in their visa application. They would commit to at least 2 years of residence in a participating community. Third, support immigrant entrepreneurship, helping immigrants and refugees to start and grow their own businesses, which would create jobs for both native-born workers and immigrants. And the fourth leg of the stool, if you will, is to invest in programs that accelerate the social integration of immigrants and refugees, such as English as a second language programs for adults. These kinds of programs would also help to reduce cultural tensions in the receiving communities. The basic idea here that local communities could sponsor immigrants for visas that would require them to live and work in particular places for a short period of time is the same as the state government sponsored visa program that's outlined by Jonathan Rauch in a just published article in The Atlantic. Only his version of the idea is to make state governments sponsor the visa applicants. I prefer to place local communities front and center. I don't see a need to involve state governments in the placement, in the resettlement process. Ultimately, communities are going to have to step up and become full partners in resettlement, and that's where I would place the emphasis. If you're interested in the details of my particular plan, I'd be happy to share them with you. Just let me know and I can email it to you. Next slide. My own plan aside, what kinds of immigration policies will Americans actually support? We have a good deal of polling data that show a 2/3 majority supporting the legalization of many of the undocumented immigrants already here. Even among Republicans, almost half favor a pathway to legal residence. Even larger majorities support giving DACA recipients permanent legal residence. There's also broad support for policies like expanding staff to process asylum seekers at the border, and for investing in root causes programs. 2/3 of Americans also support either raising the level of immigration or keeping it at the current level. Next slide. In fact, since 1994, there has been a steady trend toward acceptance of higher immigration levels which is the solid blue line at the bottom of the graph. Next slide. But these generally tolerant views of immigration run head-on into the toxic politics of immigration in Congress. Congress has failed 3 times since 1986 to pass comprehensive immigration reform legislation. And I think it's highly unlikely that the legalization measures that are written into Biden's $3.5 trillion budget reconciliation bill will survive the legislation writing process. Those measures would create a pathway to legal status for several millions of people, including agricultural workers, other kinds of essential workers, DACA recipients, and holders of temporary protected status visas. All of that is likely to end up on the cutting room floor. Hyper-partisanship is driving the paralysis on immigration in Congress. Republicans have staked out immigration restriction as a signature cause. They campaign on it. They raise money off it. Plus, the Electoral College and the overrepresentation of smaller rural states in Congress give disproportionate weight to anti-immigration voters. Finally, the ghost of Rahm Emanuel, the ex-mayor of Chicago, still stalks the halls of Congress. Rahm famously described immigration as the third rail of American politics. Whatever you do about it, you'll end up losing more votes than you gain. Next slide. Will this calculus of political gain and loss eventually be eroded by the kinds of demographic and labor force trends that I've been discussing? Maybe. The most plausible scenario would be for labor shortages to become so deep and systematic across regions and across job categories that we literally run out of workers. And we start paying a significant price in terms of economic growth. Next slide. Here's how it might play out. Labor shortages will cause numerous disruptions in constituents' lives, and they will damage small businesses in congressional districts, prompting a wave of constituent complaints to members of Congress. There will be mounting evidence of production losses and slower economic growth at the national and state levels. An inadequate supply of low-skilled immigrant labor for things like childcare and household services could negatively impact the labor force participation and incomes of high-skilled US-born people, particularly women. In fact, that's already happening, according to economics research. Next slide. All of this will noticeably depress GDP growth. By how much? We have one reputable model that predicts that the penalty of declining fertility and slower labor force growth will be at least 1.4 percentage points per year off GDP in the next decade, assuming no increase in immigration. That might not be enough to get the average voter's attention, but it could nudge some pro-business Republicans in Congress to take a new look at immigration policy. Next slide. That's about all I have to say. I'll stop there and be happy to take your questions.
Wonderful presentation, Wayne. Oh my gosh, so dense in information. We do have one question that came in through the chat, which I'll read. Communities with high population decline are likely to have poor employment opportunities. Might sending migrants there not cause resentment from locals who want those jobs?
Right. Theoretically, that is a possibility, but at least under my plan, the refugees and immigrants wouldn't get sent there in the first place. Communities would have to opt into the program by demonstrating that they do have a viable employment base. In fact, that they have specific job shortages in specific types of jobs for particular kinds of skills. So they would have to actually, to be included in the program, they would have to demonstrate that they do have an employment situation that would not only accommodate the newcomers, but could have multiplier effects for native-born residents of the communities. So if the program operates the way that I envisioned it, it would be a win-win for everyone in those places.
All right, thank you for that. And we've posted Wayne's email in the chat for those that were interested in receiving that. So I'd like to open it up now to the floor. Please raise your hand electronically if you have a question. We have one that just came in the chat. Thanks,
Vanya,
Wayne.
have you I see everybody now?
Have you had any reactions to your plan? Could you comment on?
Okay. My plan was actually briefly unveiled by Pete Buttigieg during one of the Democratic primary debates in the summer of 2020. I guess 2019 it must have been. And it got quite good traction in the national media for a while. The media coverage was strongly positive. But then I think, proposals, detailed policy proposals like that tended to get lost in the shuffle as the campaign went on. Biden's plan, his comprehensive immigration plan that he published during the campaign, actually includes my plan. It was folded into the larger Biden platform after Pete's campaign collapsed and after I joined the Biden team. And it was complemented by something called regional green cards. That was not my idea. It was part of Biden's more comprehensive plan. And the idea would be to increase the number of green cards, permanent resident visas, for those parts of the country that had the greatest need for new workers. So did that part of Biden's plan get much attention? I don't think so. There was hardly any discussion of it. But again, the fire and fury was all aimed at the border enforcement related components. And of course, Trump made it his business to focus on border security and these other kinds of policies aimed really at tweaking the legal immigration system in one way or another, tended to get lost in the shuffle as the campaigns went on.
Indeed. Another question came in from Sally. What else can individuals do to nudge Congress other than voting and messaging to them?
Yeah, I think it would be important. One of the things that could happen is for people to be very proactive in volunteering to help rebuild our refugee resettlement infrastructure. This is a structure that was starved of resources under Donald Trump. It was responsible for settling virtually all of the refugees, asylum seekers accepted into the country from 1980 on until Trump's election. Trump basically zeroed out refugee admissions. So these organizations, hundreds of them across the country, basically folded. They had to dismiss most of their staff, and they were put in mothballs for the remainder of the Trump presidency. Biden would like to ramp up refugee admissions as quickly as possible. He's certainly very focused on Afghan refugees, but more broadly, the goal is to increase to raise the cap on refugee admissions. But we're really not well enough equipped to do that yet. There's going to have to be a whole rebuilding process to get the resettlement program back in operation. And that is what we need to have in place for the federal agencies involved in resettlement to have a partner at the local and state levels. And I think the more Congress gets the message that there are lots of citizens out there ready, willing, and eager to help in that rebuilding effort, I think that will definitely help the cause.
Thank you. We have a question from Lawrence Krauss. Lawrence?
Hi, Larry. Can't hear you, Larry. Unmute.
My feeling is that immigration policy will change because the basic politics of immigration may change. It will be recognized that Latinos are basically very conservative people. And once the Republicans know how to appeal to them, then the policy favoring legal immigration might change quite drastically.
Interesting. The Republican Party certainly has its eyes on the Latino vote. Donald Trump managed to get more Latino votes than any of his immediate predecessors, except for George W. Bush. He got about a third of the Latino vote in 2020, which proved that a Republican presidential candidate, even one with all the negative baggage that Trump had on immigration, could successfully appeal to at least a segment of the Latino vote. You're right, Larry, that many Latinos are culturally conservative, but they're also predominantly working class. And whichever party appeals to them most effectively on the basis of bread and butter kitchen table issues is going to have the privileged position. But I think your point is generally well taken, to the extent that Latinos are viewed as an increasingly important constituency for both parties. And to the extent that Latinos themselves would welcome a more expansionary immigration policy, and some of them don't. Some of them are third, fourth generation native-born Americans for whom immigration policies are either irrelevant or perhaps even threatening in some way. So it's a complicated set of variables. But that's a very interesting scenario that you hold out, and it's worth keeping an eye on.
Thank you. Bob Knox, followed by Ron Kempnell.
Yeah, thanks for the talk, Wayne. That was great. I'm wondering if the recent wrap up, if you will, of our 20-year attempt at some nation fixing in Afghanistan is going to color the prospects for nation fixing in the Central American Triangle or elsewhere.
Yeah, it couldn't help but color it to some extent. I think, in view of the Afghanistan withdrawal, we certainly can't depict any kind of root causes effort as being nation building. We probably can't even successfully depict those kinds of interventions as rule of law or democratizing reforms. I think we would have to focus very narrowly on violence reduction and on things that can be done to jumpstart economic growth in these countries. And I would call particular attention to climate change. I think to the extent that you can marry the root causes approach to a comprehensive strategy of climate change mitigation, that should gain considerable amount of traction. And that tends to get lost in the shuffle when we're talking about push factors in places like Central America. These countries are increasingly climate change basket cases, and they're being battered by increasingly intense extreme weather events. So that, I think, is a fruitful way of framing the root causes approach that could get fairly widespread public support, but certainly don't call it nation building, and focus primarily on the economic component and the climate change component.
Thanks.
Thank you. Ron Kebnell?
Yeah, could you talk about international effort for Afghan resettlement? And seems like there's already immigration backlash in some countries like Italy and Germany, and the challenge that's going to show in Europe. But what can we do, to coordinate with Europe? I guess international approach to Afghan refugee settlement and the challenges there.
Ron, I don't really know very much about what the European countries are offering to do. I know that over 100 countries have expressed some interest in helping to resettle this relatively small number of refugees. So the numbers are small enough that they ought to be easily absorbable into the EU countries, plus Canada, plus the United States, Australia. So the numbers are favorable, they're manageable. I would point out that, at least in terms of the United States, the numbers are small enough to run most of them through our refugee resettlement program alone, particularly if we can gin up community partners to do it in the way that I've been talking about today. Afghan refugees are relatively well educated. They're not at all comparable to Central American asylum seekers in that regard. So they're bringing significant human capital that we actually need. And I think that this should, again, help to build support, not only for bringing as many as possible here, but to helping them succeed in a variety of ways. Again, it's a manageable number of people, and I think we know how to do it.
Okay, thank you.
Question from Vanya Bayon.
Yes, hi, Professor Cornelius. So you mentioned the high number of current job openings. Since pandemic unemployment benefits have just ended, people, especially on social media, have reasoned that the millions of Americans who were claiming these benefits will soon be forced to fill jobs, no matter the safety or low wage concerns. How do you think this will affect the undocumented population who have been filling these jobs due to the low interest during COVID?
Yeah, I would be surprised if there were drastic changes in the composition of the workforce in businesses that have depended upon undocumented immigrants. These are still predominantly or overwhelmingly manual jobs that involve working very difficult, inconvenient hours, even though wages have gone up significantly in many of these businesses as the pandemic has ground on, because the businesses have been forced to do that to compete for workers. I can't see the kinds of jobs currently being filled by undocumented workers in those businesses becoming attractive enough to US born workers who are no longer eligible for long-term employment compensation benefits to really change much of the labor supply picture for those businesses. I just think that there are so many different disadvantages to holding those kinds of jobs. And certainly there's a higher level of COVID risk, just generalizing across job categories. So I think these are likely to remain significant niches for undocumented immigrants. I don't really see any significant increase in head-to-head job competition between native-born workers and immigrants in those businesses. I would be very surprised if we saw that.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next question from Christine Hunfeld.
Yes, Wayne.
Hi, Christine.
Hi, Wayne. So good to see all of you. I would like to turn around the conversation and look at the United States for a second. And I'm very much concerned, and ever more so, about the decision-making process in this country. How is it possible, for instance, that through executive order, a guy called Trump can actually build almost 500 miles of wall that was fully against the popular will? And I mean, it's a power play, no? It's a power game all the time, but something seems to be very wrong with pushing through the right ideas for the right people. So I was wondering what you take on this kind of internal dimensions of the problem.
Right. Well, I would answer it this way. The Constitution and the courts have generally recognized that that presidents have extraordinary powers in the area of immigration. And that will continue to be the case, barring a significant change in, the case law and constitutional authority to make immigration policy decisions. The good news is that because presidents can take all these executive actions, they can also be undone through executive action. And that's exactly what Biden is in the process of doing. It takes time, however. And one of the problems that we have right now is that so many of these nefarious, fully finalized regulations that were finalized during the Trump administration are still on the books. And they're still having negative consequences in all kinds of ways. The courts are the key players, I would say. The courts have become the principal venue for making immigration and asylum policy, at least during the last 4 or 5 years. Every bad policy that Trump tried to put in place or did put in place was immediately litigated by pro-immigration groups. The same thing is happening now under Biden. Every regulation, every rule that he tries to rescind, he gets taken to court by conservative state governors and anti-immigrant organizations. I don't believe that the federal judiciary ought to be the primary venue for making immigration and asylum policy, but that's what we're stuck with right now, as long as Congress is paralyzed on the issue. And that's why I keep coming back to what are the conditions that need to be met before we can reduce the stasis, reduce the toxicity of immigration in the Congress, because we need new legislation. There isn't going to be any broad scale legalization program absent new legislation. It's just not going to happen. It can't be done by executive action. My place-based visa in my plan, that can't be created by executive action either. It's got to be part of an immigration bill, however comprehensive it turns out to be. So again, we need to change the political calculus in Congress to really make progress in this area and to reduce at the same time the role of the courts in settling these matters.
Wayne, I want to jump in with a follow-up to that. How likely do you think with the current electoral map that we can arrive at that? Any kind of electoral change that would allow us to come to some sort of consensus on new legislation?
Well, it depends on how broad a brush you want to paint with. Is it possible to do anything about the Electoral College? Most people would say no. We have to live with it. Is it possible to do something about congressional gerrymandering that has the effect of overweighting anti-immigrant voters in each election and making Congress more responsive to their wishes? So there's some structural issues relating to the U.S. electoral and broader political system that ideally would have to be addressed. I have to go back to the question of what can we do to demonstrate to the average American that their economic self-interest is riding on a more expansionary immigration policy. To the extent that we get more buy-in from the average American for a set of policies that will not only meet important humanitarian needs, but can also really expand the economic pie for everybody living in this country. One other example of the need to do that, I mean, anyone who is concerned about reducing gender-based disparities, race and ethnic-based disparities, effectively addressing those kinds of inequalities in the society really cannot be done effectively in the context of a shrinking pie. So to the extent that immigration can be reframed as an engine of economic growth, economic revitalization in many parts of the country, then we will be expanding the constituency for a more enlightened approach.
Thank you. We have questions from Jean Hemingway, followed by Peter Gorovich. Jean, go ahead.
Yes, I just want to give credit where credit is due in the idea of trying to get more collaborative processes in these kinds of handling of asylum seekers. We do have the Jewish Family Services here locally is doing an absolutely tremendous job of handling as many as 400 people a day in that process of getting them from the border and housing them, getting them processed in health assessments, COVID assessment, and helping them. Most of these people, many of them have family or people they know in the States that they want to connect with. So they actually assist them in getting flights out, pick them up from different places, get them to the airport, get them oriented how to manage getting on a plane and traveling in that way. They've done a tremendous job, and with their efforts, they are looking and growing as an organization to try and come up with a best practice for helping with these kind of processes.
Yeah, that's a great example, Jane. And there's also Lutheran Social Services, probably has a local operation. Many of the faith-based communities are active in this area. I would just say as a general rule that NGOs have an absolutely essential role to play. But we have to get refugees and immigrants who don't qualify under our asylum laws for that kind of status. We need to get them into the country, which means so that these organizations can actually actively get involved in resettling them. And right now, what we have is the revolving door, the Title 42 revolving door. And unfortunately, the Biden administration, for understandable political reasons, is clinging to that. So we need to get some of these restrictive policies out of the way so that organizations like the ones that you cite can do their work.
Thank you. Peter Gorovich,
Peter.
unmute yourself, Peter.
Sorry, I didn't get my curse. Hi, Wayne. Great talk. Expectedly wonderful talk. My question, in a way, follows up in a way where Jean is headed, is that as I was thinking about the politics of this, what are the chances of not, why do you think about it as an aggregate problem? Is it possible to break it up and find constituencies that you could help, like with a family policy? For example, as what Jean said, and I've heard also that many of the people coming, they find their family connection here.
Yep.
So that policy used to be more like that. It used to help specific groups from specific places. It wasn't as universal. Mm-hmm. What are the chances? I don't know the detail. I don't know enough about this, but what are the chances of trying to break it up and try to help people from different countries who have big constituencies here? Instead of thinking of it as an aggregate, all refugees, why not make it more country specific or religion specific? Even let, churches, and you see what I'm trying to say? In other words, break it up in constituent pieces to which you could then rally allies and therefore provoke less. That would complicate the opposition, I think, maybe. Political strategy that I'm asking what your thought of.
Well, you're very, very correct that a lot of the resettlement that we've been talking about would be family-based to some extent. The majority of even Central American asylum seekers seeking to come into the country do already have relatives living in the U.S. So what needs to happen is to reunify those families as quickly as possible. And one of the noxious policies that Trump put in place was to require would-be sponsors of refugees and other kinds of immigrants to come forward and provide evidence of their own legal immigration status in the United States. Obviously, this had a hugely dissuasive effect upon families that had one or more undocumented members. Biden has gotten rid of that policy, but it took him longer than it should have. It's one of the things that we recommended that he do on day one. Well, it took 3 months to do it, and that slowed down the whole process of getting asylum seekers placed. So yes, to the extent that this can be portrayed, framed, and facilitated as a family reunification process, that is all to the good. I'm also a big fan of involving, as we've been talking here, faith-based communities as extensively as possible. I actually wrestled with this question when I was trying to formulate my plan for resettlement for the campaigns, and I came down on the notion that if faith-based communities or other segments of communities got involved in resettlement as community partners, that was fine. In fact, that was highly desirable. But you couldn't structure the resettlement program in such a way that a locality or a state, in Jonathan Rauch's formulation of the idea, could discriminate on the basis of religion or ethnicity or some other ascriptive criteria. So my idea, the way I came down on this was involve all of these players as fully as possible, but not on the front end of the process. Get them all involved as community partners, but it's really the community that would solicit the intake of new refugees. Is this the kind of thing that you have in mind?
Yeah, I was thinking of that, plus, favoring people from specific countries, which might mobilize more. Yeah, I was thinking your terms. I'm trying to think of what could we do to mobilize people, groups of the population.
Yeah,
to become advocates. So we give more authority to the faith-based people. They could become advocates. We help them build their organization, their group, their constituency, their people. Right. And the same way we find out what are the countries from which there are the largest number of people here, make them advocates and support. In other words, are we paying a price by seeking something general, inclusive, everybody solve all the problems? Maybe we should think smaller and mobilize more support that way. That's my unformulated thought.
Yeah, well, I come back to the desirability of community-based resettlement. And if you can involve all of these players, including the diasporas, in actively resettling and supporting newly arrived refugees and other kinds of immigrants, that's all to the good. I would keep government, especially the federal government and state governments to that extent, as far out of the process as possible. I think that politically, it makes the resettlement program more vulnerable if opponents can argue that it favors particular source countries. That was always a problem in dealing with Mexican migration, formulating policies that, for example, would increase the intake of Mexican nationals in certain visa categories. There's really very little constituency in Congress for that. And in fact, it's part of Rahm Emanuel's third rail politics. So I can understand the logic of what you're saying, but I think politically it would be difficult to overtly include that as a criterion.
Great.
Thank you. Wayne, we have a question from the chat. Are more people being hired to deal with asylum cases?
Excellent question. One of the first policy recommendations that we made to Biden was that he increased the number of asylum officers stationed at our ports of entry 24/7 by at least a factor of 2 to 3. And that is, in fact, that's what the Biden administration has committed to, a step level increase in the number of asylum officers in place at the border, able to do initial processing of these folks. That is really essential, and this is why we pushed so hard for it during the campaign. It's really essential to avoiding the impression that there is chaos at the border, that people are just flooding to the gates, and there's no orderly process for getting them vetted and into the country. So the practical issue is, how long does it take to achieve that step level increase? I did some poking around researching on the training required to take, let's say, a Border Patrol agent and retrain them as a fully qualified asylum officer? And the answer I got from most experts in the government was at least 3 months. So, this is eminently doable. They'll have to find the resources to do it. Our recommendation during the campaign was to go to Congress for an emergency supplemental request of quite a few millions of dollars to fund this increase in asylum processing capacity. I don't think that has happened because there has been no legislative request to Congress yet. So I think that they're scurrying about trying to divert funds from other parts of the Homeland Security budget to cover the increase in capacity. But it's absolutely essential to have it there. And we're not so much talking about asylum officers at the federal level, but in those ports of entry all along the southern border. It's got to be part of the solution.
Thank you so much. Are there any other questions from members before we thank our speaker? Last chance to speak with this great expert on this topic.
Good questions. Nobody wants a parting shot.
All right, so we will thank you, Wayne, for this
one
fabulous
question, one final
presentation.
question.
One more question.
Go ahead, Christine.
Yeah, what is your next step?
My next step?
Yeah.
To fade away.
We won't let you do that, sorry.
Yeah, needless to say, I am not part of the Biden administration. However, I'm still friends with a lot of colleagues whom I worked very closely with during both of the campaigns. And these folks many of them occupy senior positions in the administration, in the State Department, in Homeland Security, and so forth. And I see my role now as reaching out to these folks who really do have their hands on the levers of power and maybe pushing an idea or two their way that they might be tempted to act upon. Obviously, if any of them reach out for advice on something, I'll be happy to chip in my thinking. But they know where to find me. Right now, I'm devoting most of my time to providing canine therapy for hospital patients in Portland. And I'm finding that a very gratifying and socially important mission. And I'm happy to be of social service in that way.
And Wayne is joining the Maritime Mentor Program as a new mentor. So we're very pleased about that as well. I have a question from Penny Adler.
I'm eagerly awaiting contact with my new mentee.
Very good. Penny Adler?
Just a quick question. In terms of those that already are in the line to get amnesty hearings, I know a family that's been a year and a half, 2 years, and they keep coming up and then it's canceled because they don't have anyone available to hear the case. And you mentioned that are they doing anything to get more judges or whoever has to hear these cases? And
yeah, I'm glad that you asked the question. There's this gargantuan backlog, 1.4 million cases. Is going to take years to work that backlog off. I know that the Biden administration will ask Congress for a lot of money to expand the number of immigration judges. Unfortunately, many of the judges that are in place right now, in fact, the majority of them, were appointed by Donald Trump. And they're just as likely as not to deny a petition based on their general stance toward immigration. So there's got to be a process of replacing those judges with ones who are more favorable to the kinds of clients that you're talking about. The Biden administration seems to be interested in doing more to accelerate processing of asylum seekers at the border. They don't really, they really have not talked about doing a full court press, if you will, to tackle the backlog in the immigration court system. So the short-term policy is to avoid putting as many people into the immigration court system, to reduce the number of people still being dumped in that system, and to adjudicate their cases in other ways. It's going to take time, and it's unfortunate that under Donald Trump, the backlog basically doubled or tripled, and it will take a while for us to work out of that hole. Thank you for the question.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Professor Cornelius, for this really intellectually stimulating and a very, very important topic. All of the members present join me in thanking you for your good work and your terrific presentation. Have a great day, everybody. All right. Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.